Sitting silent and hulking on the ocean floor is the wreck of a legend, the German battleship Bismarck. It's a ship that's been deeply, deeply mythologized and misunderstood since that fateful day in 1941 when it last saw the sunlight. In 2025, Magellan, the deep-sea exploration company, went to visit Bismarck on one of their campaigns, and they documented it very extensively. Now, I've actually been part of the efforts to help interpret some of the footage, to digitize it, to put it on their Patreon and their YouTube channel, and to bring it to you, the audience, to enjoy. Some of the stuff that my team and I have been going through and finding is really remarkable. It actually changes our understanding of the way that Bismarck was built and operated. We've busted some myths already, and we've even been able to get a deeper understanding of her design and her layout. I sat down with two of my very good friends for a special video that we'll be publishing to Magellan's YouTube channel. I was joined by Drachinifel, host of the well-known naval history YouTube channel of the same name, and Mr. Joe Lavender, the naval historian and author who's an expert on all things Bismarck. Together, the three of us looked over a good bit of footage. This is the first in a new series where we look at what's down there and interpret exactly what's going on and what state the wreck of Bismarck is in. This is a segment from that video going over some interesting stuff. If you want to watch the entire thing, head on over to Magellan's YouTube channel, and I'll put the link in the description and the pinned comment below. So please enjoy as Drachinifel, Joe Lavender, and myself look over some very interesting wreck footage of the battleship Bismarck. Well, let's just get it rolling, because we'll start, what better way, I think, than the bow down. And I know when Joe and I were seeing this for the first time, and inevitably it's the first thing people comment on, it's the sheer state of preservation. And I think that opening shot is what does it. You see the decking, the planking is exactly as it was. The paint on the barbettes, it's remarkable.
Yeah, I think that's a shell impact just going out of frame there on the left. Probably one of the smaller shells.
And the other thing that becomes very quickly apparent is the weird juxtaposition of the state of preservation of the ship and the state of preservation of the damage caused during the final stand.
You've got this sea snowfall, which is kind of built up around the base of the barbette here, but there's not a huge amount of it. I think this is something people have to really remember. No two wrecks are alike in the deep sea, because you've got the wreck of Titanic, which is rusting away at a rate of knots because of some form of steel-eating bacteria that happens to live in that portion of the ocean. And even though this is still the deep, cold waters of the North Atlantic, clearly whatever lives in that part doesn't live around Bismarck.
And we're lucky to have that, because you can see just how clear it is. You can see the paint around the base of the barbette, the black lining that they did anywhere that met the deck, and then that gaping maw of a barbette that goes down 5-6 stories, and the teak decking, it's all there.
This is Bruno barbette, I think, coming up in front of us now.
Which, if it were on land, would be a building in its own right.
Yeah, the thing that shocks me is the scale of this stuff, because from an ROV camera, sometimes it looks small and you really can't get the scale, but that's what, like 2 stories tall?
2-story building.
Yeah, if you go on one of the surviving US museum ships and look at the second turret of an Iowa or a North Carolina or a South Dakota, and I think these things are actually fractionally taller because the Bismarck's actual gun house is a little bit taller and the clearance is a bit more. So yeah, this is obviously a catastrophic penetration of Bruno turret's barbette. And this isn't the famous shot that actually blows out the back of her turret after punching through the face of the turret. It's another shot. It'd be rather interesting at some point to try and work out exactly what size this is, because there's a fairly nice radius on that secondary plating internally. Obviously, the shell's gone internal to that, but we could perhaps, if that was a 14-inch penetration from King George V, it would rule out 16-inch from Rodney. But given the angle, considering we're coming down the port side, I have a suspicion this is probably Rodney's handiwork.
I would agree too. It's the right spot, but you can still see the charring there. I mean, it's it's a catastrophic hit to punch through that much armor. I mean, we're looking at devastation on the highest magnitude here.
So some viewers have asked when they've been looking at this, is the barbette made up of laminated armor? Because it looks like that on some of the pictures. And the answer is no. The barbette is made up of several individual plates in curved sections, but the barbette is made up of a single solid piece of armor for the armored section. There is internal structure because obviously it has to support the rotational mechanism. There's a part of it that has to turn, and that obviously has to be supported by its own structural steel. In the case of Bismarck, obviously all of that's been ripped out and gone sailing down into other parts of the ship. But what you do have in some parts of the barbette is you have separate exterior structural plating supporting other things, and this is a perfect example. You can see here on the left we've got this essentially brown now box, but you can see it's got a little bit of plating around the back to help it mount, and it's been presumably bolted onto the face of the barbette. So that's a separate bit of steel. And when you look over the top of the barbette as the ROV comes along, you see what seems to be a line, but actually as the ROV comes up and over, what you'll be seeing is really kind of two elements. One is the fact that you have a completely flat top initially, which is what we're looking at just now. And then as we keep going, you'll see the inside of the barbette is actually a little bit chamfered. And that helps to make sense for, there you go, so that you can see it's flat and then it chamfers off. And obviously that gives the impression of a line. But also you can kind of see when we're looking at where it's been breached, you can see various gradations of color. Now, some of that is going to be from the fact that the shell has come through and there's been different physical effects as the shell has passed through. But you've also got to remember this is face hardened plate. So the actual physical structure of the outside that we're looking at now versus the inside where the steel is softer is also going to be different. So if you combine the fact it is actually physically different front to back, with the fact that the shell has punched through and done all sorts of weird and wonderful things to it. And of course, the poor thing's been sitting on the seabed for the better part of 80 years. There's going to be some discoloration going on.
It's weird, isn't it? There's like, is this primer or is this just discoloration, do you think? The yellow?
I have a feeling that's discoloration, because if you look on, there's this kind of darker band, some form of other metal again, and so like a metal hoop around near the top, and it all seems to be clustering around there and then dripping down. So I think what it might be is whatever metal that is probably as you can tell from its appearance, it's somewhat more reactive with the local environment than the steel itself. It actually reminds me a little bit of Yorktown, because her steel is in fantastic condition, but some of the magnesium and aluminium parts and parts that we know where there were alloys of magnesium and aluminium presence, like some of the light anti-aircraft mountings and such, for some reason those have massive blooms and corrosion, even though theoretically you'd think that especially aluminium would be even less likely to corrode. And it's just down to what is the local sea life environment. Obviously, in this case, whatever bacteria and such like exists here doesn't particularly like Krupp armor steel, but it absolutely loves this little band of material that's gone around the turret.
And I also think too, with the burning, there's a lot of areas of the ship where the paint's been burned, and I think it reacts a little bit differently once it's been exposed to fire as well.
I think one thing I hadn't appreciated to that point was the actual way that this was manufactured. The overlapping joints of the barbette itself. And it's interesting. You can just make out the lip, the interlocking lip here on the bottom left. And it seems like that hit has blown out almost like a perfect chunk of that, an armored segment, if you want to put it, on the barbette's armor itself. Because it seems to have happened right on the lip of one of the joins. Someone pointed that out on a YouTube video I did.
The armor plate has to be forged. especially this kind of thickness of face hardened plate. So you can't just cast a massive armored ring and lower that down. You cast it in a series of curved segments. So you can see here there's a backing plate, or I forget exactly. I think it's called a lapping strip, something like that. That's bolting these two sections together, just here on the left. But obviously, you don't want to massively compromise everything by just having a seam running all the way through that could be blown open.
So, Joe, can you give us a bit of a understanding of what was happening just around about the time this was going on? Because I know that Rodney was blasting hell out of Bismarck, along with the massed armada that had come to meet her, but especially Rodney. She's laying close by. Around what time was this happening? What was the state of affairs? And what happened to B Turret?
So B Turret, she's taking a thrashing because she's so high up. And as Rodney and King George V are sailing down her port side very deliberately, as Bismarck is yawing and fighting in these seas. And we have to remember the weather that day is just awful. And without any steering capability, her rudders are essentially destroyed. She's bucking and moving, and her gun layers are just having a heck of a time getting these guns on target. She's initially very accurate and straddles Rodney almost, within just a couple of salvos, which is miraculous given the fact that she's in such poor shape as far as her steering goes. And as she's being pushed around, of course, the guns become less accurate, and they're having a heck of a time in forward fire control, keeping her on target. And it's not working. They're one thing about the Germans is the longer they're engaged, the less accurate their fire becomes. And you throw in these variables, the sea, the fatigue, the terror of the whole thing, that they're doing a pretty good job. Now, A turret and B turret, they're taking a lot of punishment. They're the first two that are going to be knocked out. The famous explosion on B turret that ends up blowing out the back plate, that pretty much kills everybody that's within the blast radius behind it. By this point, Lindemann and Lucian's staff, they're almost certainly dead. And anybody who was sheltering in the area of the open bridge would have been killed immediately, as this turret's it's firing towards Rodney and King George V, so it's at about a 45-degree angle to port, maybe a little more, a little less. And anybody behind it, and there would have been people behind it sheltering from this storm. And we hear about this later on C and D turret, Caesar and Dora, where they're just doing their best to hide from this rain of metal that is coming down on them. And one of the best places to hide is behind these barbettes. But early on in the battle, there would have been very few people up here, but anyone on the open bridge, and there were people who were making their way up by this point, would have been killed immediately. It's one of the worst places in the world to be. There's no escape. You have two battleships that are essentially just going to work one side and turn and come up the other. You can't maneuver. Fire control's taken out fairly early on. The forward in the foretop of the ship, first gunnery officer's killed, and that's by a shell from a cruiser. And her fighting ability just degrades minute by minute. It's worse and worse and worse.
It's almost a little more like a dismasted warship at the Battle of Trafalgar or something, just sitting there with frigates all around it.
That is a perfect example. She's still dangerous, but she's not going to maneuver.
Yeah, and when the forward half of her armament is out, and although she obviously does have a backups to her fire control systems, the fact that she's lost primary fire control, primary range finding, poor old Schneider up there, really, really good gunnery officer, but wiped out pretty early in this fight. It basically means that she can only hit back with half as many guns as she had to start with, and with somewhat reduced accuracy. And of course, the less that she can hit back, the more opportunities her opponents have to hit her. and things just start to add up very quickly. And in terms of why I don't believe that this is the hit that blows out Bruno turret, if you look at the plans of the 38 centimeter turrets that the Germans have, this hit, if you kind of track in what would have been in here, because obviously the turret and all the internal mechanisms have fallen out when she sank, but what would have been down here is the gun pit below the main guns themselves, or gun pits, I suppose, because there are two of them, the central rotational spindle, and some of the hoist mechanisms. So if that shell's then gone in and detonated essentially within what we can see, so pretty much above this row of pinion teeth, but below the level of the barbette armor terminating, then most of the explosion and shrapnel is going to be absorbed by the internal barbette facings, by the underside of the guns, by the gun trunnions, by the lifting mechanisms for the guns, and to a certain extent by structural plating, which makes it relatively unlikely that it's going to cook off any charges that happen to be lying around waiting to be loaded into the guns, because they're going to be right at the back of the turret. So there's going to be a lot of stuff in the way. And if something is perhaps set off in the hoists or something like that, then you would expect there to be an upward motion to the explosion. So the explosion would obviously be contained by the barbette. It would then lift Bruno upwards, and that is what they would observe. But instead, what the observers on Rodney see when they see the shell come in, they track it in because they're that close at that point, and they say it strikes the turret face itself, so a little bit higher, and then it blows out the back plating. And that makes far more sense for a strike on the turret face, because at that point, assuming it's not actually hitting the guns themselves, a shell that penetrates through the turret face is then going to travel either down one side of the gun or that it's next to, or between the guns, depending on exactly where it hits. And there's not really anything between, once it's got through, and the rear areas of the turret, with the exception of some of the sort of relatively light, when you're talking about a shell that weighs over a ton, relatively light loading mechanisms, at which point, when it does detonate, the vast majority of shrapnel and explosive effect that it's generating that's then continuing to go forward is basically directly shotgunning into where you'd have charges stored in the rear part of the turret. And that would generate, potentially, obviously, if it sets off those charges, the kind of explosion that Rodney's crew describe, especially since obviously a good chunk of that shell's mass is going to keep going. So it's going to probably be striking the rear of the turret as well. And there's an outside possibility, potentially, that if the shell's fuse for some reason, perhaps going through the faceplate, was damaged, then it might have just also physically smashed into the back plate, and the shrapnel that it's shedding on the way through sets off the charges. Obviously, we'll never know what the exact mechanism of detonation was, but it means that a shell traveling through the faceplate and then through the turret in some way makes a lot more sense for what's described by Rodney's crew, as opposed to this hit. Because bear in mind, obviously, the shells are coming, even at close range, they're coming in at a slight downward angle. They're not coming in horizontal, and they're not coming in upwards, unless Bismarck was on a really, really bad roll to starboard at the time, which would be yet another 1 in a million shot. So it's far more likely that this shot would have really messed up the gun pits and the gun elevation mechanisms. But I think by the time that this hit occurred, they had much bigger problems to worry about in Bruno turret.
And I agree. And I think the placement of this hit too means that Rodney's further down Bismarck's port side at this point. And it comes later, I believe.
Yeah, because there's not a huge amount, if any, horizontal angle evident in the way that shell's punched through. So which means that hit's been either perpendicular or near perpendicular.
And you're
At which point,
perpendicular,
yeah, which means Rodney is basically level with the forward part of Bismarck when it's firing, which is, as you just said, that's going to be somewhat later in the engagement than initially when she starts off kind of off Bismarck's port bow.
And thanks to Magellan, we have beautiful imagery of the B turret, Bruno, upside down, and we can see the damage. And it's much more consistent, I believe, with the hit to the faceplate.
Yeah, we'll pick that up when we Yeah, when we check it out, I think that will be really interesting to analyze that, because unfortunately the turrets to a layperson such as myself in their current state, very confusing to look at. Pieces of superstructure, upside down. You can pick out, there's a searchlight platform and there's, a ladder. It gives you a sense of scale. But I know you look at those turrets in the same way I look at Titanic's shredded stern section, and you rub your hands together and you say, oh, look, there's this. But to me, it's all Greek. What interests me about this shot in particular, as always, like little technical details, but that doubler plate holding on.
Doubler plate, that's it.
Yeah, holding on for dear life. Like, and it's amazing that it held. It didn't. It's still got that plasticity even under that intense immediate impact. It's not brittle steel. It's been bent out of shape, but you can still actually see bolts, I guess. They're not rivets, but still some of them sitting in the holes.
Yes, it's bolted.
Amazing.